So this week's readings revolve around international cultural differences regarding power norms within a society. That is to say, any culture is probably going to have, or any country is probably going to have more than one culture, or at the very least lots of subcultures. And any one country is going to be made up of lots of individuals who do not quite believe the same things about what should or should not be in a society. But even given these differences, this variability in countries, there are probably some overarching expectations that kind of countrywide typify in some way the majority opinion or the majority culture or the majority expectation for the way things ought to be. Now, the House article takes a look at the way the GLOBE program studies, like their methods, the way that these cultural norms relate to cultural expectations about power and leadership. This article gives you a good idea about how cross-cultural psychologists can look at something so broad as culture across thousands of people in dozens of countries and come up with some useful data for comparisons. Now, this article is pretty short, and it's mostly focused on methods. Which cultural dimensions are they looking at, what it has to do with power and leadership, how they look at those things. So it doesn't give many answers to these questions, but it does explain this is how we learn the things that we want to learn. It's a very interesting article. The Arundel et al. Article are looking at similar and sometimes overlapping cultural dimensions. They're kind of taking it for given that the variability in these cultural dimensions affect power structures across countries, and that all of these things together affect the subjective well-being of the people within these countries. They're looking mostly at masculinity-femininity scales, individualism, collectivism, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, and they're correlating all of these things with subjective well-being. Now, for the purpose of your projects and for the purpose of this class, it's important to note that there are many aspects of cultural and human diversity that are influenced by power dynamics and that influence power dynamics, and that may influence the country's overall levels of well-being, oppression, etc. Now, we've been talking about some of these dimensions as individual cases, but of course, there's a certain level of intersectionality, which is where multiple dimensions of human diversity kind of compound upon one another and influence one another. So when you have gender, race, culture, class, all kind of stacking on one another, statistically, you may be able to parse out what is most influential in subjective well-being, or for the purposes of our class, disaster preparedness or climate change risk, things like that. But in the real world, when you're talking about social and environmental justice issues, it's important to realize that all of these factors are at play. So even though we can statistically parse them out, which you'll see in the Arundel article, we also have to consider that these things are still influencing one another, and that all of these things are important to our studies and must be considered in our studies. Which takes us to Prelatinsky. Now, Isaac Prelatinsky is a community psychologist who has a very long history of work in social justice and liberation. He is one of the forerunners in our field, and I highly suggest that you read this article carefully and then go out and look up everything else he's ever written, because it's wonderful. He's really great thinker. Prelatinsky is focusing here on the concept of psychopolitical validity. Now, as background to this article, in psychological research, part of the research process is to assess validity. We got construct validity, which is, do our terms in our study make sense? We have internal validity, which is, does the logic of our study actually study what it is we're trying to study? There's external validity, or if someone else did this study, would they get the same results, or were the results that we found only true for this one case, or only true because I was the one who was studying it, or something like that. So we have all of these different forms of validity that we have to kind of justify within our research. Now, you'll remember that in cultural community psychology, we are highly interested in the context of the situation. And so psychopolitical validity, which Prelatinsky coined some years ago, is basically that. In our research, are we looking at the context in which whatever factors it is we're studying are at play and how the context may influence these factors. So for example, we'll say this class, we have a study that we have created and we are working on, and we are trying to measure disaster preparedness in Kalihi Valley. So to what extent are residents of Kalihi Valley prepared for disaster, and why are they prepared to whatever extent they are prepared? So we have a survey that we create, we have a few different questions, we go out, we ask everybody in Kalihi Valley all of these questions that we've come up with, and we find that 10% of homes have a disaster preparedness kit. And so our study then asks 4 questions. Why is it that you don't have a disaster preparedness kit? And the things that we came up with that might be reasons are you too busy to get one together? Can you not afford it? Do you not have the space in your home? Do you not care to bother having a disaster kit? But these reasons that we've come up with here, these are all individually focused reasons. They're individually driven reasons. And Proletinsky would say that that study does not have psychopolitical validity. We're not considering the context of the situation in which this disaster preparedness occurs. The government systems, the educational systems, the cultural systems, the economic systems, that the much bigger systems, much bigger than any single person within our study, or any single family within our study, but these systems can still influence what it is that we are looking at, can still influence what each person is doing. So we're not looking at any of that. We're only looking at these person-centric reasons behind why they aren't prepared. So are they too busy or too lazy or too poor to bother? But we're not considering that perhaps in the culture of Hawaii state, we think that our state or our military will care for us in a case of disaster, so there's kind of no point in having a disaster kit. Or we're not considering that perhaps with the current economic crisis, a whole slew of people in Kalihi Valley lost their jobs, and the lack of disaster preparedness kits has less to do with individual income and more to do with a global economic crisis. That means that in this area there just isn't very much income to be had. We haven't considered any of these possible contextual reasons. We're only looking at why do you as a person have or do not have a disaster kit. So if we focus on individual only, when we try to address a problem, we may only be putting a band-aid on the issue, rather than actually addressing the root of the problem. Psychopolitical validity means, in essence, to what degree does this study attend to the much larger context, especially with regards to social justice issues. It means attending to what is going on within the power hierarchy in a society, and how is that power hierarchy affecting individuals and communities within our study. So psychopolitical validity is one more aspect of validity that we as cultural community psychologists must attend to. And so these are the things that we've been talking about in this class and will continue to be talking about. So we have a very interesting week ahead of us. You guys have been doing a really terrific job addressing these very nuanced issues, and I'm really looking forward to reading through the discussion forums this week. So I will see you online.